In his final shift, this canine police dog uncovered a secret that no one expected. Diesel, a retired German Shepherd canine, is taking his last tour through the airport when his keen senses lead him to a dangerous conspiracy. What begins as a simple farewell mission quickly escalates into a heart-stopping chase that uncovers a human trafficking ring tied to high-ranking officials. As Diesel pushes through exhaustion and injury, his loyalty and instincts will test the limits of what one dog can do to stop an international crime. Diesel's paws clicked rhythmically against the cold, polished floor of the airport. His once dark coat, now speckled with streaks of gray, moved with a steadiness that matched his age. He was no longer the young, spry dog who once sprinted alongside Claire, his handler. Today was different. Today was his last shift before retirement. The final tour through the airport, a place that had been his home for years, was a bittersweet walk of memories. Beside him, Officer Claire Davis smiled down at him, her hand resting lightly on his back. She had been his partner through countless cases. The bond between them was deeper than words could say, forged over years of shared danger and triumph. Diesel's brown eyes flicked to her, his expression calm, though there was something about today that felt strange to him. Something in the air, a subtle shift. The airport hummed with the usual chaos. Distant chatter, rolling suitcases, the low murmur of voices coming from the terminal shops. Diesel noticed it all, but his attention was split. He was tired, yes, but his nose still worked tirelessly. And something different tugged at him. A faint scent, sharp and foreign, cut through the usual airport smells of food, cleaning supplies, and the scent of new luggage. He paused. His nostrils flared as his ears perked up. The scent was faint, but it wasn't right. Diesel's gaze shifted, scanning the crowd, but Claire didn't notice. She patted him lightly, urging him forward with a soft, "Come on, Diesel. Let's finish your last shift." But Diesel didn't move. His instincts kicked in, and the world around him seemed to slow. The scent was growing stronger, thicker, something metallic, something wrong. Diesel growled low, his throat vibrating with warning. Claire's footsteps faltered for a moment as she glanced down at him, but she only frowned and tugged at his leash, urging him on. "Diesel, we don't have time for this," she said, her voice calm but firm. But Diesel's body was already shifting toward the source of the smell, his senses guiding him, as they always had. Claire's voice faded behind him as he moved past the check-in counters and into a quieter area of the terminal. The hum of voices around them seemed distant, muffled. His ears were locked on the strange scent, too faint for most people to detect, but impossible for him to ignore. Claire caught up with him, pulling at his leash. "What is it, boy? What's wrong?" But Diesel kept moving, determined. His mind was focused, narrowed. Something was wrong. There was danger ahead. Diesel wasn't sure how he knew, but his body responded instinctively. Without another glance at Claire, he slipped free of her grasp and turned down a narrow hallway toward the back offices, the forbidden part of the airport. Claire's footsteps quickened behind him, her voice now tinged with concern. Diesel stopped, but Diesel's paws were a blur, and he kept going, his keen senses leading him through hallways and past security checkpoints. Claire's calls grew faint as Diesel surged ahead, following the scent with an intensity he had not felt in years. It led him farther away from the terminal, past the bustling terminals, and into the dimmer, quieter parts of the airport. The smell was darker now, heavier. Diesel's mouth grew dry, his muscles tense. He had been here enough times to know the back hallways led to storage areas and loading docks, the places people weren't meant to wander. He passed a security guard, who barely looked up at him, too busy with his duties. Diesel's instincts were undeniable, however, and he could feel the energy around him shift. Something was wrong, and it wasn't just the strange scent. Ahead, he saw it, the loading dock, hidden behind a pair of steel doors that swung open just enough to reveal shadows moving in and out of a van. Diesel's breath quickened, his eyes locking on the figures unloading crates. His body stiffened, a low rumble vibrating from deep in his chest. He stopped dead in his tracks. Claire caught up with him, panting from the sprint, her eyes scanning the scene. "What is it, Diesel? What are you?" Her voice trailed off when she saw the men in black, moving quickly, too quickly. They weren't doing anything that seemed right, This wasn't how cargo was handled. And then Diesel's growl deepened, sharp and warning. The figures froze. The air seemed to thicken as one of the men turned, his eyes locking with Diesel's. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, without warning, the man's hand shot toward his jacket, pulling out something metallic. A gun. Diesel's growl escalated into a full-on bark. The sound was sharp, aggressive, louder than anyone would expect from a dog of his age. His muscles tensed, his focus clear. Claire shouted something, her voice tight, but Diesel was already reacting. The world exploded into motion. The man's hand tightened around the gun, his finger brushing the trigger. But before the chaos could truly unfold, Diesel lunged forward, pulling Claire backward just as the shot rang out, missing them by inches. The air was filled with the acrid stench of gunpowder, and the van's engine roared to life, tires squealing as it lurched forward, attempting to escape. Diesel wasn't done yet. His old legs, once slower and more deliberate, seemed to surge with a newfound strength. He leapt over crates, his bark echoing through the alleyway as he gave chase, his mind fixated on the men now scrambling for their escape. Behind him, Claire hesitated, still trying to process what had just happened. Her hand hovered near a radio, but Diesel was already moving. She didn't have time to doubt. She trusted him, and she followed. The men in black had stolen a head start, but Diesel's resolve was unshakable. As the van tore around the corner, Diesel's body surged forward, and the chase was on. The sharp scent of diesel fumes and rubber met Diesel's nose as he dashed through the dim light of the back alley. His paws skittered over the uneven concrete, pushing against the slick surface of a rain-drenched morning that seemed unaware of the chaos unfurling in its midst. Each breath he took filled his lungs with a raw, sharp air that spurred him on. His limbs ached from years of service, but something fierce and untamable surged within him, each stride bringing him closer to his goal. The van ahead, tires skimming over puddles, cut corners with reckless speed, its engine thrumming angrily in the quiet streets. Diesel's attention shifted, narrowing. The men were still in there, hiding behind the metal shell of the vehicle, trying to lose him in the winding maze of industrial backroads. Diesel's nose twitched, the scent of the men mingling with the bitter edge of something heavier, something colder. Beneath it all, there was something darker, something that made his fur bristle. Claire's voice broke through the thick hum of tension, pulling him back to reality, her breath heavy with exertion. "We're almost there, Diesel," she called. Her footsteps pounded behind him, the sound of her boots slapping the wet pavement sharp against the silence. Diesel didn't look back. She was with him, but his job, was ahead. He could feel the change in the air. Something was off. The scent had twisted, now laced with a more sinister undertone. No longer was it just the hint of those men, their sweat, their sharp cologne, the underlying fear of escape. No, there was something else, lurking like a shadow beneath the surface. Then he saw it. The alley split into a dead end, the van barely visible now, parked beside a nondescript building. Diesel's nose flared, pulling in every whisper of scent around him. He barely registered the sounds of Claire's hurried steps behind him as he veered to the side, his instincts telling him the men were hiding something inside. The door to the building was cracked slightly open, and from inside came the clinking of metal, heavy crates being moved, harsh voices hissing in low, urgent tones. Diesel paused, listening intently. He could hear the faintest scrape of something against the floor, the unsettling sound of a lock turning. His ears flicked back. Without a sound, he shifted into the shadows, his paws barely making a sound as he moved along the perimeter of the building. The scent grew more intense, now unmistakable. His sharp senses told him everything he needed to know. This wasn't just smuggling. This was far worse. Behind the building, the flickering light of a single bulb cast long, strange shadows across a small loading dock, where men dressed in black worked hastily. The crates were stacked high, and Diesel could just make out the silhouette of a figure, a young woman, huddled in one of the crates, her body pressed against the cold, splintered wood. A faint whimper broke through the silence, soft and fearful, barely audible over the clattering of crates being loaded into a van. Claire's voice came from behind him, edged with uncertainty. "Diesel, what's going on? What did you find?" Without looking back, Diesel took a cautious step toward the crates. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, but he couldn't ignore the soft cries, the scent of sweat and terror mingling in the air. The crates weren't filled with goods or cargo. They were filled with people, bound and desperate. His paws scraped the cold metal of the crates, each sound echoing in the hollow space around them. Claire moved up beside him, her eyes wide as she saw the faces of the hostages, their expressions hollow, their bodies stiff with fear. "Oh my God," Claire whispered, her voice barely audible, the shock clear in her eyes. "Call for backup," Diesel barked, his voice urgent despite his exhaustion. But Claire was already pulling out her radio, her hands trembling as she spoke to the dispatcher. Diesel kept his gaze on the men, still unaware of their discovery. His focus never wavered, his ears rotating, catching every sound. The rustling of feet, the snap of plastic sheeting being pulled over cargo, the faint rattle of chains. He wasn't done yet. Despite the exhaustion crawling through his bones, Diesel stood tall, determined. He couldn't rest. Not now. Not when lives were hanging in the balance. Claire's voice came again, shaky but resolute, as she knelt down beside the crate, speaking softly to the woman inside. "We're gonna get you out of here," she whispered. "Help's coming." But the situation was far from over. Diesel, still on alert, lifted his head, sniffing the air. His nose twitched, catching the faintest shift in the wind. The scent of danger hadn't dissipated. It had only grown stronger, fouler, as though more was hidden behind the scene, unfolding. There were more involved. Diesel was certain of it, and the threat was far bigger than they had realized. As they waited for backup to arrive, Diesel remained vigilant, scanning the shadows for any movement, his eyes sharp despite the heavy weight of fatigue. His aging body felt the strain, but he pressed on, his instincts never failing. The hum of approaching sirens finally filled the air, but Diesel wasn't ready to stop. He stepped forward, nudging Claire to follow him, his sharp gaze darting to every corner, every possible exit. Claire, now fully aware of the enormity of the situation, hurried to secure the hostages and make sure they were safe. The crates were stacked too high, hiding secrets within their cold, unyielding walls. When the authorities arrived, the scene erupted into a frenzy of activity. Officers moved in quickly, their voices loud and clear, taking control of the situation. But Diesel wasn't done yet. He caught the faintest whiff of something even more troubling, a trail that led deeper into the complex web of the trafficking ring. Diesel's sharp nose and keen eyes led them down a new path, one fraught with more danger than either he or Claire had anticipated. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that the operation reached far beyond the airport. Officials and businessmen had their hands in the dark dealings, and the mastermind, whoever he was, remained a shadow at the center of it all. Despite his age, Diesel continued to push, each clue leading them further into the heart of the conspiracy. Claire was amazed at his commitment, his unrelenting dedication to the mission. She couldn't help but feel the weight of it all, the realization that the danger was closing in, that every answer led to more questions, more complications. The once steady rhythm of Diesel's breathing began to falter. His pace slowed, and his body, aching, bruised from years of service, couldn't keep up with his willpower. His fur, once thick and glossy, now clung to his ribs with each shallow breath, the graying streaks of age more evident in the harsh fluorescent light. Claire watched, helpless, as Diesel's legs wobbled beneath him. "Easy, boy," she murmured, reaching out to steady him. Diesel's eyes met hers, a silent understanding passing between them. The fire in his gaze hadn't dimmed, but his body betrayed him. The chase had taken its toll. Claire knew it was getting worse. Diesel hadn't been this worn out since the early days of his career. She tried not to show her concern, but it was impossible to ignore the way his body shook with every step. He was old, far older than most working dogs, and every day, it seemed, he fought harder against time itself. Still, Diesel refused to stop. He had one last task to finish, and he wasn't about to let anyone, least of all Claire, stand in his way. The trail led them deeper into the heart of the operation, a labyrinth of offices, warehouses, and hidden back alleys. Diesel's nose twitched with every new scent, each one more revolting than the last. He followed the trail into a nondescript building at the edge of the industrial district, where shadows seemed to press against the walls like the weight of a secret. Claire stepped cautiously behind him, the smell of oil and dust thick in the air. Diesel's movements, though slower than before, were deliberate, his nose down and his ears alert. Every small shift in the wind seemed to tell him where to go next. The building was unremarkable on the outside, but inside, the air was thick with a different kind of tension. A faint echo of voices rose from deeper within, muffled by the walls, and Claire could hear the faint scraping of crates being moved. Diesel's body tensed, his steps becoming more purposeful as they approached a door, barely cracked open. Through the gap, Claire could see the faint glow of a light spilling from the other side, barely more than a sliver, but it was enough to reveal shadows shifting, the occasional metallic clang, and figures moving quickly, carefully. Diesel growled, low and soft, the sound vibrating in his chest. His hackle stood on end. This wasn't just a place for stolen goods. It was a heart of something much darker. Without warning, Diesel pushed forward, his body moving as though he was still in his prime, despite the weariness etched into his movements. Claire reached out to stop him, but she knew better. Diesel had made up his mind. The door swung open, revealing a warehouse filled with stacked crates and large tarps covering something that smelled too much like fear. Diesel, still resolute, trotted in, his nose leading him toward a large crate in the back. The rusted metal screeched as he nudged it aside with his nose, and Claire, following closely behind, stepped into the space. Her eyes widened as she took in the scene before her. The crates weren't just filled with supplies. They were filled with people. Young, old, their faces hollow, their eyes wide with terror. The metallic smell of blood and sweat was unmistakable now, thick and choking. The air felt suffocating, heavy with the weight of lives being stolen. Claire reached for her radio, but Diesel's bark cut through the air, sharp and demanding. He was still on the move, his eyes darting from one crate to another, nose twitching at every new scent. His body, though battered, seemed to have been given new life in the face of this discovery. "Hold on," Claire whispered to the frightened people, her voice breaking as she moved to comfort them. Diesel's movements became quicker, sharper, his instincts guiding him as he searched for the last of the traffickers. The scene in front of them was only part of the larger web, a network that seemed to stretch out beyond the warehouse and into the city, maybe even across the globe. As Claire secured the area and called for backup, Diesel moved with a renewed urgency. He darted between crates, his paws scratching at the cold concrete floor, his body pulling him forward even as he staggered under the weight of exhaustion. His ears flicked at every noise, his senses more attuned than ever to the faintest sounds. And then, there was the final piece of the puzzle. One man, alone, fumbling to load a crate into a van, clearly unaware of Diesel's presence. The man froze as Diesel's bark echoed across the warehouse, sharp and commanding. The air seemed to crackle with tension as the man turned, eyes wide with panic. Claire shouted for him to stop, but Diesel was already moving, his movements quick, his old body propelled by sheer force of will. He lunged, his teeth sinking into the fabric of the man's jacket, pulling him off balance. The man crashed to the ground, his gun skidding across the floor as Diesel stood over him, growling. Claire was there in an instant, her voice steady as she commanded the man to stay down. The authorities were already en route, but Diesel didn't wait. He had one last mission to complete, and he wasn't going to stop until it was finished. As the police arrived, Diesel's body sagged with exhaustion, but his eyes never lost their fire. The ring was broken, but the mastermind, the one who had orchestrated it all, was still out there. Diesel's task was done, but his work had only begun. As the authorities cleared the building, Diesel collapsed on the cold concrete, his breathing shallow. Claire knelt beside him, her hand gently resting on his head. He looked up at her, his eyes full of trust, full of the loyalty that had carried him through his entire life. "You did it, boy," Claire whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "We did it." Diesel's eyes fluttered closed, his breathing slow and steady, but there was no mistaking it. He had given everything for this mission, everything for the people he loved, and for the world he had sworn to protect.